Well, good morning, everyone. How is everyone doing today? Fantastic. Well, I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about the most exciting thing in my life, perhaps not in your lives, and hopefully not ever. It's the law. Yeah. More specifically, we've come here today at, as they said, the 32nd Biannual Convention of the Confederation of Canadian Unions. So, and as I understand it, as was explained to me, a collection of independent unions across Canada spanning a variety of industries. And the one thing that strikes my mind and what I was invited to speak was, more about my expertise when it comes to, in my past, with Indigenous peoples. So a little bit about me first is, my name is Daniel Legris. I'm a graduate of Osgoode Hall Law School. I've appeared in various levels of court across the country and in various provinces. I completed my articles at a law firm called Falconers LLP in Toronto. We did a lot of work for a variety of independent Indigenous organizations in the labor sector, primarily in policing, but also in various other sectors. And now I currently work at BYLD, primarily doing commercial litigation, so if you have any business needs, let me know. Absolutely, you have to, well, in this line of industry. So the thing that I can really relate to the most here is, of course, with my prior experience and something that still sticks with me with some of my clients today, and that's dealing with labor organizations that are independent more when it comes to indigeneity. And I got thinking, well, what's the thing that I can sort of talk about that has at least some bit of a value add? Because you guys live your jobs every day. You guys know what the applicable laws, regulations, rules are. You guys know how to rally the troops. You guys know how to make the most effective use of your resources. So what is a lawyer going to come here and pontificate and talk at you about? Well, the one thing I can hopefully bring to light is how independent unions might actually be able to assist other independent unions in the sectors in which I have some experience, primarily when we're talking about Indigenous policing, Indigenous healthcare, and other sorts of services which are on reserve. And the ethos really boils down to reconciliation. And the work around truth and reconciliation since the Truth and Reconciliation report came out in the early 2010s. So a little brief history about why I'm talking about this. So to go back, I'm going to try to keep the legal lecture short as I possibly can. If we go back to the 1867 Constitution Act, we have what's called the Division of Powers, which I'm sure a lot of you are aware of, but the two key provisions in there are sections 91 and 92 of that Constitution Act. And essentially what 91 does is it tells you what the federal powers are to regulate over what industries and what topics. And 92 tells you what the provinces are going to do likewise. The two key provisions that we want to sort of bear in mind here, just for the sake of argument, is section 92(16), which is essentially the general powers clause. Tells you that the provinces can have general jurisdiction over things that are of a local or general nature within the province. And then conversely, we have the sort of locus point for a lot of sticky issues that arise for Indigenous peoples in labor law and employment law. And that's section 91(27), which essentially says that the federal government has jurisdiction over, quote, Indians and lands reserved for the Indians. Now, when I say that word, I don't like it. It should be changed, but that we're using it, and I solely use that as a term of art because that's the language that appears in the Constitution, ugly though it may be. So why does that matter? Well, the word Indian matters, and the words, and this matters in the labor context, because it tells you that when you're working on a reserve, or when you're working off a reserve, it matters what's going on and what the industry is. So why, jumping back for a second, why that provincial division of powers matters is because there's banking on the federal side, for example, and there's policing on the provincial side. We all know the OPP, we all know the Sûreté du Québec, we all know what is going to become the Provincial Police of Alberta soon. But for our friends out in BC or in Manitoba or out in East, there tends not to be a set provincial police. There's a lot of local police, but there's also a lot of RCMP. So because of that right there, we can see that there's overlap. Even though policing might be a provincial jurisdiction, there's also federal jurisdictions more generally, and there's a lot of overlap. So why this matters? The cases that I'm going to refer to are essentially, I'm just going to call them broadly based, the federal court cases. So the federal court cases, when it comes to things like Indigenous policing, have essentially said that this is how we're going to dictate what the applicable labor laws, labor standards, and employment regulations are going to be in a particular area. When it comes to policing, if the money ends up going to a band, which is a term of art under the Federal Indian Act, then the law that you're going to apply is going to be of a federal nature. However, if the money goes to a police services board, which is generally a creation of policing legislation and therefore a provincial tool, well then provincial laws and regulations are generally going to apply to you. Now I think we can all sort of in this room immediately sort of jump at two things there. Number one, there's a distinction being made by the law and by the courts about what law is to apply. And from that, we get our second point, which is it tends to be the case that federal regulations and federal labors and federal labor codes and provisions, whether it be your pension, your health, your benefits, those tend to be a little bit more exacting, and the standards tend to be a little bit higher on the federal side than the provincial side. So that creates a weird situation, especially for Indigenous peoples working on reserves in these sectors which have a bit of a cross-federal, cross-provincial nature, that you don't necessarily know what law is going to apply, what benefits you should be deserving and you should get, and that leads to a lot of litigation for people like me, who unfortunately then profiteer off of that. I'm very fortunate at my old firm. We did a lot of that work pro bono, and we did a lot of work for that, a lot of work in various tribunals, whether it's in Alberta, in BC, and Ontario. But it leads to this very weird situation where people have differing standards even though they're right next door. So the case study that I sort of want to look at here in that context is the Anishinaabe-Aski Police Service. For those who may or may not know, the Anishinaabe-Aski Police Service is the largest Indigenous police service not only in Canada, but in the world. It was provincially constituted, meaning it officially became a police service in the same way that the Toronto Police Service or the Ontario Provincial Police are an official police service. In late 2024, and I had the honor, along with my principal, Julian Falconer, of being there for the swearing in for that ceremony. Now, why does that matter? Why that matters is because what a lot of Indigenous peoples on reserves and in these industries are going through is sort of what I like to call, am I allowed to swear? Okay. It is a clusterfuck of a provincial, federal, and territorial passing the buck, jurisdictional hot potato. Because the federal and provincial governments have tended to find themselves in a place where they've thrown around the word reconciliation to mean something as if we're repairing our relationship with Indigenous peoples, and we're coming here to try to lead to some sort of betterment in our relationship, that we're going to try to recognize that it's a nation-to-nation relationship as opposed to a colonial thumb on your neck relationship. But that's a lot of prima facie. It's a lot of just, for lack of a better word, it's a lot of face value, but nothing really, no substance. And what the Anishinaabe-Aski Police Service did in late 2024, by being the first provincially constituted Indigenous police service in Canada and the largest in the world, is they took a great step forward and a brave step forward. The brave step forward is the trust. Is the trust that you have to then put into the federal and the provincial governments to say, yes, you fucked us for a long time, but you're giving us the opportunity to have actual, genuine resources that match our needs, and I'm going to trust you not to hold that back from me. It's the only provincially constituted police service so far in all of Canada, so it's a good case study sort of for my purposes here. Now, a little bit more background, because I am all about the background, as lawyers tend to be, we're all context, is provincial police service or Indigenous police services in Canada are funded through what's called the FNIPP, the First Nations and Inuit Policing Program. FNIPP. You'll notice when I say First Nations and Inuit that the Métis are not part of this program. That's a whole other kettle of worms, but it just goes to some of the inherent and systemic discrimination that continues and persists when it comes to our federal, provincial, and territorial programming when we're talking about trying to give people back their rights, trying to give people back their ways of doing and being and doing things. So under the FNIPP, the federal government pays about 51% of the funding for these programs. The provincial government then or the territorial government contributes about 49% of the funding, and the Indigenous peoples, typically First Nations, because there are only about 2 Inuit police services in the Northwest Territories and Nunavut. What tends to be the case, and it's funny because that we're in this hotel, because this was right here for the very final negotiation that I had at that table with those governments, is the First Nations will come and say, we need X, Y, Z. This is for our community safety, this is for our policing, this is for our general livelihood. And what the provincial governments have tended to do, for those who are in provincially regulated sectors, tends to be the case that they're a little bit more understanding, not all the time, but they're a little bit more understanding and they're willing to make concessions. For those unfortunate enough to be in federally regulated sectors, you'll sometimes find that the Canadian government and Canadian government representatives like to really push back and talk about how tight the budget is and how poor they are. But then they'll turn around and give the RCMP or give another sector and another Crown program another $600, $700 million and say, well, but I'm broke. Which highlights the general unfairness of trying to go to these negotiating tables in the first place. So what the Anishinaabe Police Service did was really quite a fascinating thing. At our final negotiation, they came and they said, listen, we want to get across the line. Ontario said, we want to get across the line. We're trying to get this signed so that we can actually be held up to the same standards as policing in Ontario, as everyone else. And the federal government pushed back and kicked its feet and kicked and screamed, but they finally relented. So the brave step that the Anishinaabe Police Service took was then, how do I create a new labor union, because the old one had to dissolve, in accordance with Ontario's labor provisions and in accordance with the applicable employment standards. So this is finally where I can kind of circle back to what I think independent unions and how they can assist Indigenous services and Indigenous labor unions with this. And it's not dictatorial, it's not do things exactly our way, but wouldn't it be nice to have a really large union, like the Anishinaabe Police Services police union, in a room like this? It's effectively an independent union. What expertise could they provide to you and you provide to them back about how to transition into the world of being under provincial legislation, being under federal legislation, while maintaining, in the spirit of reconciliation, their ways of doing things. The word that a lot of my friends in the North would say, they're a knock and a gay one, which typically means laws and ways of doing things. More of like a literal legal term of art, but it strikes at the idea of independent unions play a really crucial role. It's not like these big laborious unions who have tons and tons of funds. I mean, you guys are fighting every day for what matters to you, to your families, and you're rallying together as individual unions collaboratively. And it's essentially the ethos of that collaboration which shares that spirit of reconciliation. The whole point that I'm trying to make here is that reconciliation and negotiation with colonial governments is more about making sure that we can empower each other than to detract each other and to put each other down. Now, I've realized that my notes on my other side have completely evaporated. So I'm going to talk a little bit more, at the risk of boring people, which I hope I'm not. About the particularities of, I'll talk a little bit more about why the particular legal situation that these people find themselves in is quite a precarious one, because that will really highlight why it's so important that independent unions can actually play a fundamental role in assisting and learning from our Indigenous brethren and sisters. So the best example I can give from a policing standpoint is, say that you have a reserve which is split between Manitoba and Ontario. The first question, and this is a hypothetical, but there are reserve lands which have been divided between provinces and between territories. So now you've confronted the very tricky situation of, okay, we've gotten around the question of if you're funded by whoever and if the funds are directed to whomever, okay, now we know whether it's going to be federal or provincial, but now we have an interjurisdictional sort of issue where we're between provinces or between provinces and territories. And what do? Well, the courts haven't really decided that, and the reason why they haven't done it is because of the jurisdictional hot potato that the provinces and the federal government and the territories, to a lesser extent, like to play. That jurisdictional hot potato, however, has led to a number of various disparities in a number of different communities. So a good example of that would be in Fort Albany First Nation up in Northern Ontario. Now that's not cross-provincial, that's in Ontario. But what Fort Albany First Nation is it's generally landlocked, although it is accessible by road. It tends to be the case that those roads get covered by ice. Those roads get covered by snow. Terribly inaccessible. So the Anishinaabe Police Service has to travel from hundreds of kilometers between these different remote communities in order to do their job. But now that introduces another complication, because as I've just said, you're traveling in between different areas which are technically of the Indigenous peoples of the First Nations jurisdiction of Anishinaabe Police Services, NAPS's jurisdiction. That space in between, though, is not reserve land. But a lot of communities in remote Northern Ontario will, instead of getting the OPP, which tends to charge too much, they'll go to NAPS or to Anishinaabe Police Service or to another local police service in the area, and they say, well, we need community safety and policing. Drugs, huge problem here. Federal government's not doing anything. Women are being stolen. It's all over the news. And it is. It's a huge, huge crisis that the federal government, the provincial governments have tended to completely ignore. And they say, NAPS, APS, UCCM Police Service, we want your guys' help because you're the only ones actually willing to travel through the snow, through the ice, hundreds of kilometers to do this work. Essentially picking up the slack of what the provincial, and not the slack of local police services and provincial police services, but picking up the slack of what the provinces and the federal government don't want to do. So you introduce legislation, however, in the form of, let's say, the Ontario Police Services Act, which says that First Nations police services are not actually really police services unless they're constituted. So the work then that is done by the Indigenous Police Service and by an officer, whether you are of Indigenous heritage or whether you're a guy who just came here from Ireland, right, and you happen to be working in policing, doesn't matter. You're not getting compensated for that specific time you're traveling in between these communities. Or if something happens to you on the job and it's not on reserve, you're not getting your benefits. The insurance company is going to deny your benefits for that. It's not always going to be the case, but trust me, I've seen many of these cases, and it sounds ridiculous. It sounds absurd, the idea that you could be traveling from one community doing your job to another community doing your job, and in that space in between, something goes wrong, and your labor, your employment rights evaporate. It doesn't make sense, but it's exactly what's happening to a lot of Indigenous people throughout this country. Giving you a little bit more of an insight into some of the experience there. When you go to some of these communities, you'll notice, as I've said, there's a lot of issues, but there's also a lot of really lovely people. And these people who have been essentially suppressed for decades, hundreds of years. And the point of reconciliation in that sense is to raise them up, to try to bring them back to a place where they want to be, to enable them to do their ways of doing things in the ways that they want to, that they exact and see their community safety, the ways that they see their own internal laws around internal labor and internal employment standards, because they exist. And it's not just that we have provincial and federal and territorial labor laws. Indigenous peoples, a lot of them will have laws and ways of doing things that can transition into those fora. The issue, of course, is not only the recognition and seeing those things as legitimate, which independent unions can help with, but also having them being heard. So an issue that arises, in my experience, has been going back to the negotiating table. So at the second last negotiating table that I was at, before we finally got a deal across the line, the federal government said, you know what, fuck it. I'm going to cut out the funding, and we're not going to do anything. So what they did is they put our clients, our communities, the Indigenous peoples, Anishinaabe Nation, which is, don't have the exact figure. I don't want to butcher it, but it is a very, very, very large chunk of Northern Ontario. We're talking, I believe, at least about 20% of all of Ontario is Anishinaabe Nation. That's a huge, huge swath of land. And the federal government said, you don't want to agree to our terms and conditions? Fine, you get nothing. Essentially putting these communities in a state of crisis. Because if you don't have policing in your community, you don't have many guarantees of safety. It would be absurd if I told you that the Toronto Police Service could not have drug sniffer dogs. It would be absurd if I told you that the Calgary Police Service could not have access to sexual assault units, to victim services. But this is precisely what the Canadian government told us and told Indigenous nations. They said, we don't think you can manage your own resources effectively enough. We're not going to give you these services. Despite the fact that sexual assaults have gone up drastically in virtually every First Nation reserve, not all, but virtually every, that drugs have been flooding into these communities, and that you have a genuine destruction of their culture happening right before their eyes in ways that has been only accelerated since, that has only decreased since at least the dissipation of the residential schools in '96. So the federal government has forced these people into a position where they have to choose between an underfunded police service that they themselves want, that will enforce their ways of doing things and their ways of living and the safety standards that they want to have put in place, or choose a worse alternative. Not a worse alternative in the sense that it's incapable, because the Ontario Provincial Police and the RCMP are very well funded, they are more than capable, but there's a deep history of obvious racism, violence, the '60s scoop, the residential schools, forcible removal of children, all of these things. Now again, bringing it back to the labor context, it's why people like Anishinaabe Police Service, like these Indigenous-led organizations which are on reserve, are so important. It's because if we're looking at reconciliation in a broad scope, we can't be blind to the fact that there is legal complications, there are historical complications. What independent unions can do, now that we have Anishinaabe Nation being the first provincially constituted police service, and many soon to follow, not only in the policing sector, but in various other sectors. We look at Mark Carney right across the street over there, and Mark Carney with his, hopefully the new budget, comes in eventually. Don't know when it's going to come in, but it'll come in eventually. But the plan essentially is this big nationwide building project, isn't that correct? And as part of this nationwide building project, we're going to have more mines, we're going to have more ships, we're going to have more pipelines, we're going to have, we hope, right? But a lot of this is taking place on Indigenous land, which is going to mean more jobs, not only for the Indigenous peoples, but for non-Indigenous peoples. It's going to mean more expertise from industries like many of your own, right? Because there's a capacity building that needs to be done. So what can independent labor unions do? Well, sharing that expertise as part of these nation building projects is going to be a really critical thing, not only to enable Indigenous peoples to exact and to realize their ways of wanting to do things, which really should be front and center, but also making sure that we're really building reconciliation as a project of repairing our relationship and togetherness. Because one thing that I think a lot of people sort of miss when we talk about reconciliation is the togetherness aspect. A lot of people, rightly or wrongly, will look at the word reconciliation. It's almost become a little bit of a dirty term to some people. They say, okay, well, you have your rights, you have your tax advantages, which really, I will tell you, they're not that great. The tax advantages are not that great, and they're very disparate. But yeah.
Sorry, really funny in my room.
No, it's true. It's true. But people look at reconciliation now, unfortunately, and they say, well, what more is it going to cost me? Why am I doing X, Y, Z? Like, aren't we all equal now? And the answer is unfortunately not, by virtue of that example I just gave, because you'd never get the federal government telling the Toronto Police Service you're not allowed to have your own victim sexual assault crime unit, right? You're never going to go to Toronto and say, yeah, there's enough mercury in here to that, maybe 5 glasses of water will kill you. And Grassy Narrows First Nation is still on the longest boil water advisory in North America's history. So the fact of the matter is we aren't equal right now. But as part of the nation building projects that are hopefully coming up, whether you agree with them or not, they're probably going to happen. And it only benefits the labor unions, in my view. We can all have respectful disagreement, but it only benefits labor unions, especially independent ones, to seize those opportunities, to go into these areas and to say, well, how can I help you and how can you help me? Especially when we're confronting a situation where a lot of independent labor unions are dissipating because the bigger ones are sort of absorbing you. It's a fight. So finding that sort of collective spirit together with these new unions, with these new sectors that are going to be springing up is, in my opinion, one of the better ways that we can sort of not only preserve ourselves as independent unions, but grow and grab the mantle, so to speak, and thrive together. And that, to me, really suits the spirit of reconciliation ad hominem. The last thing I'll talk about is why exactly that matters. And I've talked about why it matters. It's sort of been like the phrase, you do a shot every time I say why it matters today. You can do it retroactively too tonight. And so why all of this really matters, again, jumping back to the jurisdictional hot potato, why it all matters is because it's people's lives at the end of the day. And I got about 15 minutes, so that's good. You know, we're roughly hitting time, so I'm happy. The jurisdictional hot potato really matters, and why we really need to keep this one thing in mind is because of a young boy named Jordan. And Jordan was a young boy who in the late 90s, early 2000s, had a very rare disease. Some of my Indigenous friends will kind of know where I'm going with this. So to keep it sort of long and short, the jurisdictional hot potato cost Jordan his life. Jordan was a 4-year-old boy. He had a very rare disease, and he went to hospital. And when he went to hospital, the federal and provincial government could not decide who should pay for Jordan's treatment because, as we know, Section 92, see, full circle, Section 92 of that Constitution Act says health administration is a matter of the province. But Section 91 says Indians in lands reserved for the Indians is a federal problem. And when I say problem, it's because the federal government treats it like a problem. And they went back and forth over who should pay for this kid's health care for months and months and months. And you know what happened during that time? Jordan never got health care. And he died.
Shame.
And that's what led to what is called Jordan's Principle. And again, I'm not to toot my own horn because it's not my horn to toot, but I was honored to be at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, somewhere in this sector, when the decision came out finding that 16 years after the complaint was made, that the Canadian government had systemically and institutionally discriminated against Indigenous peoples by denying them their rights to health care, by essentially playing this game of jurisdictional hot potato on who should pay. And the principle is essentially treat the child first, squabble about who pays later. And that principle can and should be applied to a lot of different areas here. When I talk about the negotiations with Canada and them essentially holding these services, their community safety, as sort of a carrot with the stick right behind them. Give them what they need, squabble about who pays and its effectiveness later. When we go into these nation building projects, no doubt, there's going to be, well, whose labor standards apply? Because in the policing sector, it's kind of easier to figure out. Provincial police service boards are a creation of provincial governments, right? Although I disagree with the federal court, and I think, you should probably want to get the better standards that the federal labor codes can apply, or get the best of both worlds, right? we're certainly going to come to this point where, like Jordan, Indigenous peoples in these communities are going to be trying to get things moving, trying to get things done, trying to do things to better themselves. And the provincial, territorial, and federal governments are no doubt going to be kicking and screaming, saying, it's your job, it's your job, it's your job, it's your job, because minds at large might be just the same as Maritimes. Dealing with the Maritimes and maritime law is federal at large, but there's a lot of provincial regulations that come into play. And they're going to start arguing about who should do what and who should do when and who should do why, and they don't want to pay for it. So one thing that, as labor unions, what we can do is say, you know what? We have this cross-expertise between the federal and provincial sectors. Many times, I imagine that some of your work is overlapping. You already have experience dealing with the bullshit that is provincial and governmental negotiations, and trying to argue with the province to get a better deal, trying to argue with the province to get better standards for yourselves. And what you can do, what would be helpful to a lot of folks who I've spoken to, is approaching these new sectors, approaching these peoples, and say, we know this is going to happen. How can we help you? And if that happened for Jordan, Jordan might still be with us today. If that happened for peoples under Anishinaabe Nation, a lot of the folks there who had succumbed to drug and alcohol issues and who had been trafficked might still be here today. So it's no doubt that you guys do play a crucial role. You guys play a crucial role in being able to bridge not only informational gaps, but being able to bridge the divide between politics. It's very easy right now in our politics to feel like you can't do anything and that what is an individual going to do? But you're not individuals, you are a collective. You are a collective of very fantastic independent labor unions. So you have that backing and you have that power to be able to create a substantial level of change and create substantial levels of progress for not only yourselves, but for others. And that, to me, is the best way that labor unions can advance reconciliation. So that's me. That's me. Now I'll apologize to Don because Don said maybe go 45 and I hit about 40. So I gave you guys another 5 minutes for a bathroom or water break if you need. So if there's any questions or I might have answers, but please.
Any questions for Daniel?
It can be totally unrelated. You can ask me anything.
Don?
I don't know if you can answer this, but we've had a discussion in the past about support for apprenticeships. So
just talking about police training, clearly rooted in colonial standards. Have the standards been adjusted to assist Indigenous peoples with training?
It's a fascinating question. So the best way to sort of think about that right now is with NAPS, because it's the only provincially constituted one. During the negotiations that we had, the federal government, it's very strange. It's truly bizarre because, again, policing is a provincial jurisdiction. You'd be surprised how different the split is when we're talking about Indigenous police services and what they spend their time doing and what, for lack of better phrasing, but it's a good blanket term, what colonial police services sort of do, right? A lot of the time what a beat cop is doing is they're on the street and they're responding to issues. That's kind of hard when the nearest community is about 100, 200 kilometers away, right? So it's a lot of driving for Indigenous police service. And when you're talking about the training, the federal government put up a lot of resistance to the proposals from Indigenous people saying, well, putting the driving part aside, a lot of our stuff is community focused because, you know, as we can probably imagine, when we're looking at the 60 scoop, you're looking at residential schools, you're looking at a cultural genocide for hundreds and hundreds of years, and all of these, and essentially displacing people from their homes, you probably have a pretty good distrust of not only government officials at large, but also the police who were ordered to go in and then, do these things. Dudley George is an example. I don't know if many people know Dudley George. Long and short of it, Dudley George was an Indigenous person who, when there was a protest at a provincial park that was part of traditional territory in Ontario, was shot and killed by the OPP. Many years ago, there was a big inquiry and a big inquest into it. And why we leveraged that as an example of, we don't need to follow the OPP's training standards and standards for how to do things to a T. We, Indigenous peoples in their own communities, will have their own ways of doing things, because a lot of it is built on reparation of that relationship with the community members, community building, recruitment, and trying to just build trust. Whereas 85% of the time that the OPP or the Toronto Police Service is out, it's as a beat cop. So there was this huge disparity and pushback for how they could, what sort of training and standards should be put in place. Eventually, we kind of got across the line where it was I won't say a concession, because any win is a win when you have the pre-pull on your thumb, on your neck. But there's a lot of disparities. Now, I can't speak more to specifics because some of it's confidential. But there's certainly a lot of different issues when it comes to not only the pushback that you get from governments, but also there's huge disparities in how a lot of individual communities view policing and what should be done for community safety. But in my opinion, that's the best part. That's exactly what reconciliation is about. It's we're implementing your vision for your community. In the same way that, the people that we elect in city council are hopefully enacting our vision for our community. To me, it's the same parallel.
Any other questions for Daniel?
Hi, thank you. It's a great presentation. My name is Barb Backmeyer. I'm from construction maintenance and alley workers out of Prince George, and local 1998. In British Columbia, the policing service is either paid directly by a municipality, say Surrey, or paid off of your property taxes. So it's not just the federal and provincial government. The provincial government's downloaded a lot of policing onto homeowners. The regional districts, which is kind of outside of main cities, pay a smaller portion for policing, whereas, for example, the cities pay a higher amount for our CMP services. So I'm not sure how that relates as far as the federal government paying, because in our case, they don't pay. Mm-hmm. So it's basically the province and the municipalities and the regional districts in British Columbia. So I just thought I'd point that out.
Yeah. No, it's a very helpful comment. I'm just trying to think of anything I could put additive, but it's astute. Yeah.
Thanks. In your experience, did you find, like, the chicken and egg scenario, was it funding was the problem, or was it deciding who actually had the jurisdiction that had the problem?
More funding. Definitely more funding. I mean, it's actually the bigger squabble on their end was about funding. The bigger point that we were trying to raise on our end was about jurisdiction, purely from the point of federal government's the one that created this program. They're the ones who created the FNIPP, from which Indigenous police services received their funding, right? it's not a really persuasive argument to say, I've created this program, but I'm just the funder, I don't want any part in this. I don't have any jurisdiction, let the provinces, because it's essentially what they're trying to do, is trying to blame the provinces for things not getting across the line, for dragging out negotiations, for putting in, and by the way, an important point about this thing when it comes to funding is that they're termed funding agreements. So they're usually for 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years, but what that does is if you agree to a certain length of term for X amount of dollars, even if there's sort of accelerators and increases, well, you've kind of cornered yourself into a shitty situation where if something happens that's really drastic and you need a large growth in funding, a la, what would be addressed in an annual budget, you're kind of putting yourself in a bad position there. So our issue was more about the jurisdiction and saying, no. You can't come here and say, federal government, that you have no real say in this other than just putting in money and kicking your feet back, because why are you even at the table then? It's also your program. Provincial governments were more about the funding, saying, we're happy to give you anything, or at least credit to Doug Ford and his government and the public safety ministers there. They were willing to give us whatever we wanted. It was the federal government saying, well, no, once you pass it, then we'll see about it. But so it's interesting in the sort of, it's interesting from the perspective that usually you're looking at a liberal government and you're thinking, well, this is the more progressive wing that's going to give us all the money, and the conservative wing is going to be a little bit more fiscally frugal, and they're not going to. But it was essentially the opposite of what happened. So that was one thing that was fascinating, but answering the question more directly, it was a bit of both. Yeah, that's sort of the interesting things that you encounter when you're negotiating with governments.
Just to follow up, did you find, I don't know if you looked into it, but was part of the argument, you should be funding this, is it's potentially better long-term community outcomes. If you spend $100,000 in policing, you're going to reduce property crimes by $150,000. Is that something that you look into, or do you have numbers for that?
Oh, definitely. And you look at a lot of individual statistics that are made available by the police service themselves. What their distance is, how long they have to travel, what are the costs of doing things, how many calls do they get per day, what is the response times, all of these things for efficiency purposes. An issue that a lot of the Indigenous police services have is that they don't have, I wish I had a PowerPoint, because I could show you that some of these police services are quite literally operating with 2 people in a remote community out of a shack. And you have to build up jail cells with drywall, which has led to unfortunate deaths in various communities. So for some reason, I went on this little tangent. But I'm so sorry, could you repeat the question? Just for my apologies. I got a little enraged.
I think you did kind of answer it, in that I was kind of curious, because this sounds like a huge project, undertaking, and if you were able to, sort of sway hearts and minds with some of the idea, investing in community policing, especially Indigenous policing, is actually going to yield better community outcomes, because you spend this money now, but it's going to reduce property crimes, it's going to reduce assaults, reduce crime generally.
And it does. And another thing, it is also, they obviously, by virtue of the fact that the funding is such an issue, they're doing a lot more with a lot less. And the one thing that is interesting, I don't know if you know this, but lawyers are very expensive, right? The Anishinaabe Police Service, former chief, no, it was it's Terry Armstrong. Terry Armstrong would hate me for saying this. Anishinaabe Police Service have, since I last checked, in the last 10, 15 years, have fired their guns twice. How many times have the Toronto Police Service fire volleys of bullets at people. And what that does, though, is bullets mean lawyers on everyone's side. That is a huge drain on resources. You'd be surprised the amount of budget that gets taken up from your local police service just on law, just on legal fees. And what the Indigenous peoples that I've worked with in these communities have done is they've taken a very non-violent approach to things, which not only leads to better safety outcomes, bold, underline, italicize that word, but it also leads to a lot less expenses. And wouldn't we all like to pay less? Wouldn't we all like to have a little bit less liability? So it is true. So that sort of also goes back to Don's point when it comes to training. And it goes to your point about looking at the statistics that you have to look at when you're looking at the funding. Not only are they doing more with less, but they're more efficient. And they're better with the resources that they have because of the sort of non-violent approach that's sort of inherent in a lot of their ways of doing things. So yeah, so it's huge bargaining points. And then when you throw it in the face of government, they try to think of another reason not to give you the money.
Any other questions?
And thank you, by the way. Great questions so far.
Alex, PBW's Local Language George. Thanks for your talk. You started with policing, was a little bit skeptical, but it's precedent setting because at the moment in BC, this is going to be really relevant to us shortly. We're in a process of devolution where they're taking 20% of forest tenures away from great corporations and giving them to native bands. There's a ton of skepticism, bordering on fear about what this is going to mean for industry. You could be optimistic and say breaking up monopolies is a good thing. You can be pessimistic and say this is going to be total chaos. Either way, things are going to change. It's a redistribution of resources. A whole bunch of new companies and stuff are going to come into existence. New logging companies, new mills, Indigenous owned and operated. Probably a lot of non-Indigenous working there too. If the independent unions don't go and court these new places and sign them up, the Uniforms sure as hell will, the United Steelworkers sure as hell will, and we shouldn't be intimidated to try to court them and try and figure out our new way of existing. And I think your work is going to be what we look to figure out how the hell to do that. You know, we should be the lesser of two evils as far as the unions go. We should be able to get on the same page in a culturally sensitive way, etc. And it sounds like you've done a lot of the legwork we're going to be looking to for inspiration.
Well, honestly,
So thanks for your talk.
I appreciate that. That's very kind. But really, it's all of your work. It's your work that is inspiring. I mean, shit, I don't get up here and talk, wake up at 9 a.m. on a Saturday and talk for an hour. For folks that aren't inspiring, that aren't doing great work, and who aren't fighting for that, and having fantastic perspectives like that. And we all don't need to agree. Reasonable people can disagree, but I think it's part and parcel with where we see our nation going. That the preservation of independent unions really relies on how do we sort of work together with our Indigenous brethren, which is where a lot of the economic activity is going to be going. And I think that's a strength for all of us. Yeah.
Don?
Just one last comment. You talk about the guarantee of safety in some of these remote areas. I say it's a bit of an illusion. My brother, 6-foot-tall Irish white dude, is part of NAPS in Fort Albany, as we discussed. Forever without parts for their vehicles. No diesel, where he actually had to step in and fight a fire for a house that was burning down. The truck ran out of diesel, house burnt to the ground. Shortage of resources, no potable water, short-staffed all the time, just like he has to fly in.
This is quite a lot of engagement, again, on a Saturday morning. My goodness. Wow. Active crowd.
I'm surprised they're awake.
Oh. I don't. Law will do that.
Yeah. No, it's not so much that as the slightly fascinating. Anyway, Carney has announced some changes to court and all that, I think Friday or Thursday or something, and I'm wondering how you think that that's going to affect some of these Indigenous peoples, because it's going to be, you need to prove why you need to stay out of jail and be released when you're offend more than multiple times, let's say. And I'm just wondering how you feel that's going to affect a lot of people who are marginalized.
So talking more about bail reform, unfortunately, I might have to take a bit of a cop-out and say I'm generally aware, but I don't think I can speak eloquently enough to provide a truly intelligent opinion about it. But my general perspective, I'm going to shoot myself anyways, and say, my general perspective is that, having an approach where we're more restorative, it's not always going to work, right? But we generally want to have more of a restorative approach than a retributional approach. We don't really get much, and it's actually quite a huge drain on our financial system to have people sitting in jails, kind of not doing anything and doing sort of really poorly paid menial work in manufacturing. But also think about what that does. If using a poor example, if you have Jim Bob in Kingston Penitentiary making an anvil for $1 an hour, well, that's also an anvil, and that's a job that's been taken from another person who could have been making a good amount of money in a unionized environment, in a good setting, right? And so why not, if we're going to give Jim Bob that job, why don't we put it in a factory, in a unionized setting, give him a proper pay, and he's probably more inclined to be a law-abiding citizen when he gets out. Now, depending if he gets out, right? But generally, I think a restorative approach tends to be a better one, rather than thinking about, how can we punish more? People have all sorts of living circumstances that they find themselves in. We all have brothers, sisters, cousins, loved ones, friends who might have fallen on hard times. I mean, we all probably know a guy in high school who crashed out, who might be on fentanyl, who might be an alcoholic, and it's a sad situation, right? Much the same way, like, people don't really commit crimes because they think crimes are cool, generally. Without having put in a more of an intelligent opinion on it, I'd say the restorative approach tends to be a better one. So I'm all in form of bail reform. If it means keeping people out of jail, means keeping money in Canadians' pockets and making things easier for all of us.
Question?
Just one follow-up, if that's possible.
Sorry.
I can understand why they're doing it when you allow someone to commit a crime in a community, set him free in an hour or two, and he's out there doing the same crime. And he's doing it because there's gangs out there that are recruiting these people to do these crimes so that they can make money. Yeah. So where do you start, and how do you... These people need help, obviously, right? But it's the higher-ups and all of that, and if we can get them to be jailed completely, then maybe our country would be less dangerous and more safe. I don't know.
This actually, I don't know how much time I'm eating up, so fantastic.
You're good.
Fantastic. So this actually kind of relates a little bit to other work I've done. When I was throughout law school, I worked with a really wonderful professor named Karen Drake. Karen Drake is of Indigenous heritage herself. She's from Thunder Bay. Brilliant legal scholar. And the work that I helped with her was with the Indigenous Peoples Courts in Sarnia and Walpole Island. And a lot of what we found, and a lot of what the old data and the new data sort of shows, now obviously everyone is different, every community is different. Not just when I say community, I don't just mean First Nations communities. I mean, Windsor is different than Walpole Island, and Sarnia is different than Port Perry. right? Everyone is different. Everyone's circumstances are different. But what we found working through the Indigenous people's courts, which tends to have more of that deferential, let's divert instead of punish immediately, is that if you focus on things like healing circles, community initiatives that sort of focus on a restorative approach, again, not everyone, unfortunately, not everyone can and will be saved. But if you focus on it, it tends to have a lot less, smaller financial impact on your immediate community, and there tends to be greater success when it turns out to actually restoring the person and becoming a contributing member of society in the way that we sort of generally view that term as not really a term of art. So, I mean, if anything, what would be very interesting and what actually is being tested out in a number of communities across Canada, not in Indigenous communities and not in First Nations communities, not in Métis or Inuit communities, is actually what is the impact of trying to do healing circles and things like that in the colonial court system. So it's a fascinating thing to see. Unfortunately, it'll take a long time to get the data on that, but yeah, I think that is perhaps a path forward.
Question? Yeah. Sean's got them up there for you.
Hi, this is Rob Stiles. I'm with Osgoode in Nova Scotia and BI. I just want to let you know, I had a question for you about some of the native leaders. I know they've gotten better, but how much money, they stole a lot of money from their own people. So I'm just curious if you dealt with that in your work.
Well, I mean, the way that I would answer that is every community, First Nations or not, Indigenous or not, there's always possibility of things of a corrupt nature going on. I wouldn't necessarily say that anyone's any more inclined or less inclined. There are examples, though, where counselors take money from folks, and it's unfortunate. But there's also examples of that in Toronto. I mean, I think we can look at not the most recent mayor, but our last mayor as an example of that. He's got it. I'm not going to say names. Oh, we might have to redact that part. But that's how I'd more directly answer that. But in terms of, I think how I can sort of use it as a tangent is dealing with, or I shouldn't say dealing with. Dealing with is not the proper term. Having the opportunity to speak with various counselors and various members of different First Nations communities, whether it's chief and council or a grand chief of a much larger area, they really, really, really care very deeply. And a lot of the focus is because money is so tight, is how do we make things as efficient as possible? So when we think about, tax advantage and this and that and the other thing, not really that great, to be fair. There's also a lot of complications. If you're a First Nations individual and you live on reserve, however your money is made off reserve, it's not exactly a guarantee that you're going to get any tax advantages from it. So in that same way, when we're looking at money flowing into communities, it's not exactly a guarantee that you're going to be able to do things as efficiently as possible. So unfortunately, you do run into situations where there's a little bit of corruption, but generally my experience has been that people are very, very deeply involved in the community and caring about how to make things as efficient and good as possible for everyone. Yeah.
Last question.
So, not so much a question, I actually just want to say I really appreciate you going off on your tangents on some of the things that you had to talk about. I don't know if you want me using this. It could be really loud then. But just on the disparities, so run it policy mom from Vernon, BC. I'm an Okanagan Indian band member, live on the reserve. I pay all of my taxes, and I actually appreciate you being able to speak on behalf of that to enlighten some of the non-Indigenous people in this room who I've had I can't even say the pleasure over 4 years because I've had a couple of interactions with a few people. They're really coming at you for again, not paying taxes, and I get all of these things for free, and I live, work, and play just like every other person living in this room, and I don't get anything extra. Living on the reserve and having to be surrounded by my people and what we have to go through. So it's wonderful listening to the stories about the Anishinaabe police force coming in, because we don't have that back home. And so I just want to say thank you. And I do like those tangents because it's kind of like an eye-opener for the people that may not want to even ask those questions, but it just comes out. So thank you for taking your time on this Saturday to do that.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
Okay.
Daniel, on behalf of the Confederation of Canadian Unions, thank you very much. For your presentation was wonderful today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Learned a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. And thank you, everyone, for waking up this ungodly hour. Oh man, to listen about the law. My God. I hope that this has been somewhat informative, and thank you all for granting me the opportunity and the honor and privilege of speaking with you today. A round of applause for yourselves. Thank you.